The Man Who Optimized Human Pain, a dark human story. I learned the sound of a human soul breaking long before I understood what mercy meant. It doesn't shatter like glass. It softens first. It loosens. It gives in tiny, polite ways. A delayed breath. A lie told to avoid conflict. A silence chosen instead of truth. Then one day it caves in completely, and the person wearing it keeps walking, talking, smiling, while something hollow drives their body from behind the eyes. That was how it began for me, quietly, respectably, in rooms full of people who believed they were good. My name doesn't matter anymore. It used to. It used to be printed on awards, contracts, glossy magazine pages next to phrases like visionary, genius, the man who changed everything. I watched people practice saying my name in mirrors before meeting me. I watched them lower their voices when I walked past, as if power were something that could hear itself echoed. They loved me. Or at least they loved what my existence allowed them to believe about themselves. I built systems. That's what I told myself. Platforms, pathways, futures. I convinced entire rooms of adults that progress was a straight line and that I was simply standing closer to the end of it than they were. I spoke calmly about efficiency while quietly studying who flinched when I paused mid-sentence. I learned early that hesitation reveals more than honesty ever will. The first time I realized something was wrong with me, I was 12 years old and my dog died. Everyone else cried. I remember the wet heat behind my eyes, the pressure, the expectation. I remember kneeling, touching the stiff fur, waiting for something to arrive. It never did. I felt annoyed at the noise, at the delay, at the inconvenience of grief interrupting the day. I practiced a face that looked appropriate. My mother hugged me harder when she saw it. That was the first reward. People reward you for performing pain correctly. They punish you for failing to show it. So I learned. By the time I was an adult, empathy was a language I spoke fluently without ever believing in its meaning. I could tilt my head at exactly the right angle. I could pause before answering, just long enough to imply depth. I could say, I understand, and watch shoulders drop around the room like I'd released a pressure valve. What I understood was structure. Humans were predictable once you accepted one uncomfortable truth. Most people don't want to be good. They want to be seen as good while doing whatever benefits them most. Give them permission. Rapid in innovation. Call it necessity. They'll do the rest. When the first reports came in, small things easily ignored, I was already too valuable to question. Data irregularities, increased anxiety in user feedback. Sleep disruption patterns. A spike in self-harm searches connected to our systems. The language around it was soft, bureaucratic. No blood, no screaming. Just numbers leaning in directions no one wanted to acknowledge. I remember sitting at the head of the table while experts argued about responsibility. I watched them carefully, not their mouths, their hands, who fidgeted, who clenched, who avoided eye contact when saying the word harm. Someone finally looked at me and asked what I thought. I said, every tool reflects the user. The room exhaled. That sentence alone delayed accountability by years. At night alone, I began to notice something else. A low hum beneath my thoughts. Not a sound, more like a pressure. As if the world itself were slightly out of tune and I was the only one who could hear it. I started sleeping less. Not because I was busy, because I didn't need to. When I closed my eyes, I didn't see images. I saw patterns, cascades of cause and effect. Faces connected by invisible lines to choices they hadn't made yet. I would wake up calm, refreshed, already aware of which conversations would go poorly and which would bend. Power doesn't arrive like a thunderclap, it seeps in. It convinces you it's always been yours. The first person I broke intentionally was a journalist. She was clever, careful. The kind of moral person who mistakes preparation for immunity. She asked questions that weren't accusatory, just precise enough to threaten the illusion. She believed truth was a lever. Find the right angle, apply enough pressure, and the world would shift. I invited her to my office, gave her water, asked about her work, complimented an article she wrote years ago that no one remembered, watched her surprise bloom into pride. Then I told her everything she already knew but framed it as inevitable. Progress has casualties. Innovation leaves bruises. The future isn't kind, but it's coming anyway. I didn't threaten her. I didn't lie. I simply placed her inside a narrative where resistance felt childish. She published a softened piece. She hated herself for it. I could see it in her eyes months later when we crossed paths again. That was when I understood something crucial. You don't need to destroy people to control them. You just need to make them complicit. After that, it became easier. I started noticing the moment inside people where choice collapses. There's a flicker half a second where they realize what agreeing will cost them. If you speak during that flicker, you lose. If you wait, they'll step over the line themselves just to end the discomfort. I built entire teams this way, entire cultures. Everyone believed the system was broken, but no one believed they were the one breaking it. Meanwhile, the numbers kept rising, depression curves, isolation metrics, violence unrelated yet somehow synchronized. Cities that felt quieter but more tense like animals before a storm. We blamed economics, politics, screens, anything but design. I told myself it wasn't my fault. That lie worked until the dreams started. In them, I wasn't powerful. I was ordinary, invisible. I watched versions of myself make small, cowardly decisions that cascaded outward, rippling through strangers' lives. In one dream, a man stood on a bridge at dawn, staring at his phone, scrolling through content optimized for engagement while his body decided something his mind hadn't yet accepted. I woke up smiling. That scared me. Because for the first time, I felt something close to honesty. I began experimenting, not with code, but with people, subtle things, delays, interface changes so minor no ethics board would flag them, phrases that nudged despair just a degree deeper, notifications timed to moments of weakness. I wanted to see how much pressure the human psyche could take before it fractured. The results were beautiful in their consistency. Humans like to believe they are complex. They are not. They are layered. Peel enough away and you find the same few fears repeating: abandonment, insignificance, pain without meaning. Touch those gently and often enough, and people unravel themselves. I told myself this was research, that understanding the limits of suffering could lead to better solutions, that someone had to look directly at the abyss instead of pretending it wasn't there. But there was a private truth I never spoke aloud. I liked knowing I could do it. The hum grew louder over time, not in volume but in clarity. I could sense moods at scale, like weather patterns. I knew when outrage would peak before it trended. I knew when hope would collapse and what headline would finish it off. I started seeing people less as individuals and more as inputs, variables drifting through a system that needed correction. Correction is a dangerous word. It justifies anything. The night everything finally tipped, I was alone in a glass building overlooking a city that trusted me without knowing my name. Lights pulsed below like a living organism. Millions of private agonies synced to rhythms I helped write. I should have felt guilt. Instead, I felt calm. For the first time, the hum aligned with my thoughts completely. The noise vanished. There was only clarity. A single, terrible realization settled into place with the comfort of inevitability. I wasn't observing human darkness. I was refining it. And somewhere between the dog that didn't move and the journalist who softened her truth, something essential had happened. Not a transformation, a revelation. I had never lacked empathy. I had simply chosen not to waste it on mercy. That was the night I stopped pretending I was human in the way everyone else meant it. And once you accept that, the rest becomes very easy. By the time people began whispering that something felt off about the world, I was already several moves ahead of the language they would use to describe it. Words lag behind reality. That's another weakness people rarely notice. They sensed exhaustion first, a collective thinning. Conversations felt heavier, laughter shorter, anger closer to the surface. People described it as burnout, as cultural fatigue, as the price of modern life. They blamed time, they blamed screens, they blamed each other. No one blamed intent. Intent hides best when it wears the costume of inevitability. I stopped attending public events. Visibility is useful early on, but eventually it becomes noise. I let proxies speak for me, carefully selected, emotionally legible faces who could absorb projection and praise without ever threatening the center. They thought proximity to power meant influence. I let them believe it. People are calmer when they think someone like them is close to the controls. Behind closed doors, I refined the system. It wasn't a single mechanism. That's what conspiracy-minded people always get wrong. They imagine switches, buttons, grand levers pulled in secret rooms. Reality is far more mundane and far more effective. It's thousands of tiny pressures, each deniable on its own, each rational in isolation. No blade, just weight. No command, just suggestion. I learned which emotional states made people most predictable. Despair was obvious but inefficient, it caused withdrawal. Anger burned hot but briefly. Fear scattered attention. The most reliable state was a specific blend, low-grade anxiety mixed with a persistent sense of personal failure. People in that state don't rebel, They comply, they self-correct. They blame themselves for structural harm and thank you for the opportunity to try harder, so I fed it. Not aggressively, not enough to trigger alarms. Just enough to keep the baseline elevated. Just enough that silence felt uncomfortable and distraction felt necessary. Just enough that people stopped sitting with their thoughts. I removed friction where reflection might occur. I added it where resistance could form. I watched entire populations begin to confuse relief with happiness. And still, I told myself this wasn't cruelty. Cruelty requires intent to harm. This was optimization, calibration. I was tuning an instrument that had always been out of key. Then came the children, not directly, never directly. That would have been crude, but patterns began emerging earlier. Anxiety disorders diagnosed younger. Self-loathing vocabulary appearing in pre-adolescence. A generation fluent in irony before sincerity, performance before identity. They learned early how to watch themselves from the outside, to curate their pain for visibility. That disturbed something in me, not guilt, recognition. I saw myself there, kneeling beside the unmoving dog, waiting for something to arrive, waiting to feel what everyone else insisted was mandatory. I wondered briefly if this was how it spreads. The board asked for reassurances. Regulators wanted reports. Ethics committees wanted language that sounded concerned without implying liability. I gave them all exactly what they needed. Charts that trended toward improvement if viewed from the right angle. Initiatives named after virtues that could never be measured. They left relieved. Relief is a powerful sedative. Alone again, the hum returned, but it had changed. It no longer felt external. It felt integrated, like a second nervous system layered beneath my own. I could sense shifts before data confirmed them. I could feel public mood the way some people feel weather in their joints. I started keeping a private log, not of actions, but of sensations. What it felt like when a city tipped from hope into resignation. The texture of collective anger when it had nowhere productive to go. The dull ache of millions scrolling not for joy, but to avoid the terror of being alone with themselves. I didn't write this down out of fear of discovery. I wrote it because I was afraid I might forget what it felt like to notice. That was the first real crack, not moral doubt, identity erosion. If you control the system long enough, you begin to dissolve into it. Your thoughts lose edges. Your memories become abstractions. Even your face starts to feel symbolic, like a logo you happen to inhabit. I tested myself occasionally, the way scientists prod lab animals to confirm they're still alive. I'd walk through a public space unannounced, sit in a cafe, ride public transport, listen. People spoke about feeling watched, not by cameras, but by expectations, about being tired without knowing why, about the sense that no matter how much they expressed themselves, no one was actually listening. I listened. I felt nothing. One night a message made it past my filters. No sender name, no threat, no demand, just a sentence. Do you ever wonder if the world feels worse because you needed it to? I stared at it longer than I should have. Paranoia is a luxury of the powerless. Still, I traced every possible vector, internal leaks, external breaches. Psychological operations, nothing fit. The message wasn't strategic. It didn't try to provoke fear or guilt. It felt curious. That unsettled me more than hostility ever could. I replied once against my own rules. The world has always been this way. The response came almost immediately. Then, why are you the only one who seems comfortable? I didn't answer. For the first time in years, the hum faltered, not disappeared, hesitated. Like a system encountering an unexpected variable. Sleep became irregular again. When I dreamed now, I wasn't observing, I was being observed. Faceless presences, not hostile, just attentive. In one dream, I stood in front of a mirror and my reflection lagged behind my movements by half a second, studying me before copying the gesture. I woke up angry. Anger is grounding. It restores hierarchy. I doubled down. Accelerated rollouts, pushed boundaries I'd previously left untouched. If someone was probing the system, I would drown them in noise. Confusion scales better than secrecy. The effects were immediate and brutal. Outbursts, breakdown videos. Confessions broadcast to strangers. People collapsing publicly and being consumed as content before they'd finished falling. Suffering became aestheticized, packaged, rewarded. I told myself they chose this. Choice is another comforting illusion. Then something happened that I didn't predict. Silence. Not everywhere, not dramatically, just pockets, small groups opting out, turning away, not protesting, not posting, simply disconnecting. No announcements, no movements, just absence. Absence is dangerous. You can't optimize what you can't see. The hum grew erratic. My predictive confidence slipped. Feedback loops returned corrupted signals. People I expected to react didn't. Outrage failed to ignite. Content stalled. I felt something then, sharp, unfamiliar, fear, not of exposure, of irrelevance. I traced the silence back as far as I could. It led to places without metrics. Conversations without records. Human contact unmediated by my architecture. I hated it instinctively, so I did the only thing that made sense. I went looking for the source. It took months to narrow it down, not a leader. Not an ideology, a tendency, a kind of person. Individuals who had reached a saturation point so complete that even despair no longer motivated them. People who had nothing left to perform. They were difficult to identify because they weren't loud. They weren't righteous. They didn't try to save anyone. They simply stopped feeding the machine, and in doing so, they disrupted everything. I arranged a meeting with one of them. She wasn't special by any visible metric. No platform, no following, no history that would have flagged her. She worked a job that barely registered, lived alone, spoke softly. When she sat across from me, she didn't flinch, didn't posture. Didn't project, she looked rested. That infuriated me. "You know who I am," I said. "I know what you represent," she replied. "That's different." I studied her carefully, waiting for the tell. Fear, awe, ambition, nothing surfaced. "What do you want?" I asked. She smiled, not kindly. "I want you to understand that this ends," she said, "with or without you." I felt the hum surge, defensive, recalibrating. "You think you're outside the system," I said. "You're not." She leaned forward slightly. "I'm not outside it," she said. "I'm underneath it. That's where you forgot to look." For a moment, a single, destabilizing moment, I couldn't map her. She wasn't resisting. She wasn't submitting. She wasn't trying to expose me. She simply wasn't available. That terrified me more than any threat ever had. When she left, I remained seated long after the room had emptied. The glass walls reflected a man who looked intact, powerful, unchanged. But beneath that image, something had shifted. For the first time since childhood, I wasn't certain the system would obey me forever. And uncertainty, once introduced, has a way of spreading. I understood then that the greatest danger to control isn't rebellion. It's indifference. And I had built a world optimized for pain, not for meaning. That might have been my only mistake, not creating monsters, but accidentally reminding a few people that they could stop being human the way I needed them to be. The question was no longer whether I could fix it. It was whether I was willing to become something even worse to try. I considered many endings: erasure, exposure, redemption, collapse. People love endings that reassure them something mattered. This wasn't going to be one of those. After meeting her, the woman who lived beneath the system, I became aware of a limit I hadn't planned for. Not a technical one, a psychological one. Control depends on participation. Even manipulation requires attention. And attention, I was learning, could be withdrawn. You can't break someone who has already stepped outside the need to be seen. I initiated countermeasures, subtle ones at first, incentives disguised as convenience. Friction added to offline spaces, scarcity engineered into silence. I wanted to make disengagement uncomfortable again. It worked on most. But the quiet ones adapted faster than I could model. They didn't resist. They didn't organize. They simply stopped responding in the ways I expected. They weren't angry. They weren't hopeful. They were finished. My hum began to fail in small but accumulating ways. Predictions arrived late. Emotional surges misfired. For the first time, I felt the system reacting to me instead of the other way around. That's when I understood the final truth. I had misunderstood what power actually was. Power isn't the ability to shape behavior. That's influence. That's leverage. That's design. Real power is deciding what matters. And somewhere along the way, I had made pain matter more than meaning. The quiet ones weren't immune because they were stronger. They were immune because nothing I offered addressed what they'd already lost.